The Continentals are recruiting, and now is the time for all able-bodied men to join in the defense of our colonies. Join us now at the Brown House as we introduce you to what is necessary to become part of our Continental forces. Come join us, ladies and gentlemen. Good citizens of London Town, I'm a member of our Continental Forces of the Continental Marine. I'm here under the authority of the Continental Congress now meeting in Philadelphia. Now is the time for all able-bodied men to step up and join our forces to put off the yoke of the British Empire. In fact, it's even more important today than it has been before. Just this week past, our duly appointed Continental Congress, made up of representatives of all 13 colonies, have declared that we are now free and independent of the crown. And those colonies know, states, we are now under confederation, united as one. It is more important than ever that you enlist in the Continental forces to throw off the yoke of the British. The word now has just been received, and I'm going to pass on to the mayor of this town to read those words that have come from the Congress.
A declaration by the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress assembled. When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their powers, their just powers, from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly, all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferances of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. He has refused to assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance, unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained, and when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend to them. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, unless those people will relinquish the right of representation in legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. He has called together legislative bodies in places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records, for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of people. He has refused for a long time, after such dissolutions, to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers, incapable of annihilation, have returned to the people at large for their exercise, the state remaining in the meantime exposed to all the dangers of invasion from within and convulsions without. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states for that purpose, obstructing the laws of naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrants hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of land. He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing to assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. He's made judges dependent on his will alone for their tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. He has effected to render the military independent of and superior to civil power. He has combined with others to subject a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation, for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states, for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury, for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses, for abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing therein arbitrary governments, and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies, for taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments, for suspending our legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny, already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy, scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages, and totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation. He has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country, to become the executioner of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. He's excited domestic insurrections among us, and has endeavored to bring the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may defy a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. Nor have we been wanting in attentions to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our immigration settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, and we have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They, too, have been deaf to the voice of justice and of consanguinity. We must, therefore, acquiesce to the necessity which denounces our separation and hold them, as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, to, in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are of right and ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from the allegiance to the British crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge together our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Signed by order and in behalf of Congress, John Hancock, President.
Huzzah! Huzzah!
God save the United States!
And ladies and gentlemen, 240 years ago, this scene would be playing out time and again as the word would spread from city to town across the United States. But at the time, it meant many different things to many different people. Recruiting parties like myself from the Continentals, and they for the various states themselves, would be looking to try to raise forces. Although these are very eloquent words, this Declaration of Independence from the British Crown would set the basis for what we would become the true United States of America. We were at the time a group of a confederation of independent states. And it would take 8 years of hard war to win the American Revolution, and another 11 years as colonies during peace to finally come up with what we call the Constitution of the United States today, before we could actually become a truly united group of American states. There was many different points of view. Our history treats us often black and white, that we had the Americans and the popular uprising of all Americans to be independent from the colony, independent from the crown and such, and throw off the yoke of that oppression. Well, it wasn't necessarily the case, as it happens in many cases. There was a small, very dedicated group of zealots that wanted to become independent from the crown. The vast majority of the American citizens, such as those citizens here in Levittown, although they very much believed in the concept of having their own autonomy to govern themselves, they didn't necessarily believe that a war against England was the best way to go. And then you also have the other side of the coin, that there were still many colonists that believed, we are Englanders. We are part of England. Why are we separated from the crown? So there was a lot of controversy, and it took several years of war before that was found place. Now, the very essence of establishing the military forces, because although we gave this declaration saying, yeah, we are free of the crown and independent, that didn't mean anything unless we were willing to fight for it. But how we fought for it would also be a big point of controversy. We raised a continental force that represented all 13 colonies was necessary. But there's still a lot of controversy about that. Here in the state of Maryland, you look around, not only do I myself, my officer, my corporal, represent those of Continental Marines. We're representing the naval services authorized by the Continental Congress. There was no money to raise these, but the necessity of having a unified force to fight for all the colonies wherever needed was necessary. There was many of the states, the various independent colonies looking at, well, we have Maryland State Marine. We have a Maryland State Navy. Why should we enlist in the Continental or pull our own men and our own forces away to fight for the other colonies? So it would take a while before the concept of a unified nation would start sinking in. see many of you out there that we'd like to enlist. Before you get turned over to the Maryland State Marines, we want to enlist you in the Continentals. We can't offer you much, and on a modern basis, like a used car salesman, we'll promise you the world, like that, but it would be time for you now. It's the time to enlist in the Continental. Who will be the first? Come on, young man. Right up there. He looks like he's the right age. Just sign your name. At this time, as they would go through recruiting and such, one of the problems the Continentals would have, both in the Continental Army and the Continental Naval Services, is although the states were authorizing the capability of bounties to enlist in the state forces, and the state navies especially oftentimes had privateers. And privateers in those state navies like that were authorized by that state or by the Continental Congress that they would receive bounty money like that in prize for any of foreign vessels like that, British vessels and merchants ships that they could seize. That money would then be distributed black through. The Continental Services couldn't offer that. So if you had the choice between going into the Maryland State Forces or going into the Continental Services, who could offer you nothing except the promise of a uniform, the promises of 3 meals a day, maybe once you got to your ship, who you're going to decide for. And then it was also the question of voids. Lots of times, the issue of our independence was far less about patriotism than it was about individual well-being and the almighty dollar. Ladies and gentlemen, as these young men sign up, does anybody have any questions?
How old did you have to be to sign up?
Theoretically, like I say, the American Revolution, contrary to common belief, contrary to a lot of us old gentlemen that are standing here in uniform, it was a young man's war, as in most wars. The American Revolution, it was not uncommon for the vast majority of the Continental Forces and the Maryland State Forces like that to be made up of teenagers. Like that as young as 15 and 16 years old, bearing arms against the nation. And again, if you look at the demographics of the time, where the average lifespan, 40, 50, 60 years old, was the oldest they would get. They were basically, young women were marrying at the age of 14, 15 years old and such. So it was a young man's war. Although it specified you should be of the age of 16 before coming into the military, that was often very quickly overlooked when it comes to filling the roles of what was needed to fight the war.
Now these young men, we're going to groom as drummers.
And if we run short, we may groom them as muskemen as well. Do we have anybody in the audience like that, or any former, current, or former Marines in the audience? Don't see any. Like I say, that's unusual. Usually there's always 1 or 2 Marines. And such. But to give you an idea, as representative of Marines, and I am a United States Marine myself, I like that although we celebrate November 10th, 1775, Continental Marines, again, like history in general, like that, is many shades of gray versus black and white. At this time, we were, like I said, in fact, in the summer of 1776, there were recruiting parties out of Philadelphia recruiting Continental Marines that were here in Annapolis and even here in Edgewater and in Londontown. Ironically, we are in the process at this point of rebuilding the small Continental Marine Force. 8 ships of the newly established Continental Navy that have been raised in October of 1775 and 5 companies of the authorized 2 battalions of Marines have been raised by Samuel and Nicholas during the winter of 1775-1776. By May of 1776, had just returned from the first major engagement on naval operation by the Continental Navy from New Providence Island in the Bahamas, after capturing the town of Nassau and Fort Nassau and seizing quite a bit of military equipment and bringing it back. Ironically, once that fleet had arrived back to New England, the 230 Marines that had come and over 1,000 sailors that were involved in that naval force almost ceased to exist. Ironically, most of the beginning casualties of that time were from disease. And then enlistments wearing out and such. So for all intents and purposes, the first United States Marines, Continental Marines, ceased to exist. So by the summer of 1776, we were literally having to rebuild the force, as was the Continental Army. One of the problems of trying to recruit people into the service at that time, we were colonies, most of them were citizen soldiers. Even the militias and such were basically farmers, merchant, like that, craftsmen and such first. They were soldiers second. and calling them away from their vocations and calling them away from the families oftentimes was very difficult. And in many cases, to basically entice these people to enlist, enlistments were no longer like we would look at the military today, where we enlist for 4 years, 5 years, etc. They were cutting the enlistments down to 1 year. Well, in reality, especially during the period, 1 year could pass very, very quickly. And that was the other drawback. By the time the New Providence raid has been completed, is those sailors and Marines that had enlisted in the Marine Corps in October, November 1775, their enlistments were now running out. And this would be a constant recurring problem throughout. If you look at the historical records throughout the American Revolution, you think of the Continental Army under George Washington, that a group of dedicated men went in and served for the entire duration of the war. Not the case. The vast majority of those that fought in the American Revolution served for a year, 2 years maybe, but only a very small handful would re-enlist and serve for the entire duration of the war. The rest would rotate back to their various families in their home colonies.
Recruitment parties like the one you're seeing here were almost certainly seen in this area and here in London town itself. We know that there's a family that lived only a block away down there, the Fergusons. Scottish by birth were the parents. And one of their sons, Andrew Ferguson, signed up with the 1st Maryland Regiment. We're lucky enough to have reenactors of the 1st Maryland Regiment today. Be sure to stop by and say hello to them. But they almost certainly signed up right here at this tavern behind us. This is where that young man began his journey into the Continental Army. And just as Gunny here has said, he served for a very short period of time. He served from February of 1776 until December 1776. But the scars of that war followed him for the rest of his very short life. That very brief service almost certainly contributed to his early death in 1778 at the age of 23. Now, he left behind property here in London town to his youngest sister, who lived just down that way. So right here in this very town you're standing in, the conflict of the American Revolution had real consequences. People lived and died in this town. People suffered through this conflict, through this tragedy. And hopefully what you're going to experience today by wandering our site, visiting our tradespeople, hopefully what you'll get out of that is an understanding that you don't have to be in uniform to be affected by the waves of history. These big trends in history, they affect all of us, today and back then. I hope you enjoy our Revolutionary London Town event today. Thank you all for joining us. There's still plenty to see. We have another musket demonstration at 3 o'clock today. And thank you all again for joining us.
Hey, gentlemen, please feel free to come up and talk to the Marines and the other staffers you see on the site. As Kyle stated, the biggest thing is to relevate as you walk through the town today, like that, whether active to civilian, military, and such. History is linear. We are making history today as they were doing 240 years ago. And think of yourself as a citizen of London town 200 years ago. How would you feel? Like that, if you came in, if a recruiting party such as this came in, you just heard a document read, such as you heard here, like that, what would you do? Would you think about, would you be willing to leave family and home behind to go fight for a cause you weren't sure that you were even going to win? And like that, think about that and think of how that decisions made by people just like you made, how they affected you and how they affect people today and how we live today. And would you be willing to do the same?
Who's next?